The past decade has seen a dramatic rise in Hollywood adaptations of African stories. While the fierce Zulu warriors raced onto the global stage in the 80s TV series Zulu, it's really Disney Marvel's sci-fi Black Panther that broke African stories into the global billion-dollar club. Unlike homegrown cinema like Nigeria's Nollywood, Hollywood blockbusters like The Black Panther and The Woman King do not have the same African direction. Even with the best of intentions, these adaptations share common pitfalls that stick out like a sore thumb. Well, let's dive in and find out what today's Hollywood gets wrong about Africa. Accents. Accents are just one of those things that we pick up from our environment as we grow up. Suffice it to say, actors that grow up outside of Africa do not have natural African accents. So, some go for the dependable South African accent, while others go running for the Nigerian accent.
Why are you running?
Most have taken to a generic African accent that sounds like a love child of a Nigerian prince and a South African queen. Apparently, foreigners seem to understand Southern African accents the best. This melting pot of accents is hard to ignore when members of the same tribe, who should really have the same language environment, speak in vastly different accents. In The Woman King, for example, King Gezo, acted by John Boyega, uses a Western African accent.
Migan, we have been under the foot of the yo-yo since my father's time. Are you not tired?
Nanisca, acted by Viola Davis, uses a generic African accent.
I should put you out. I have watched soldiers die because they did not have discipline.
While her protege, Nawi, played by Thuso Mbedu, sounds South African.
The men who are soldiers have wives and children.
To be fair, she is actually South African, but should be playing a character from West Africa. Dodgy accents aside, accents are often entirely divorced from geography in Hollywood projects. Wakanda, which is supposed to be somewhere in East Africa, is entirely made up of tribes that speak like they just walked out of the Kalahari Desert.
Ukuba uphinde wakuxhukumisa ndakuqoma apha kwesishihlalo.
Now, bad accents are unlikely to detract from Hollywood projects internationally, but they can affect immersion to those who understand African linguistics. Technology. 21st century Africa is still a deeply traditional continent where traditional influences seep through everyday life and design. What this means is that people still occasionally use traditional tools and will occasionally dress up in tribal garb. What it does not mean is that people stick to impractical tropes when practicality matters. Africans today have modern lifestyles and will engage in modern warfare where necessary. Meanwhile, Wakanda, which can cure spinal cord injuries with magical black balls, still arms its best warriors with melee weapons and battle rhinos. These tactics would make them cannon fodder for even the weakest national armies in Africa today. Even African insurgents have long discovered that Kalashnikovs and invisible Toyotas are much more effective than spears and clubs. The Woman King is no stranger to this trope, as the Agoji are depicted as a melee army when they were in fact often armed with rifles. Melee battles sure may be more cinematic, but they remain an unrealistic trope reserved for fiction. Identity politics. Identity is an important component of African culture. Most people in Africa can trace their ancestry to specific tribes, which have had a sorted culture of war and diplomacy. The Woman King actually does a good job depicting these through the rivalry between the Dahomey and the Oyo tribes. The colonial era was a turbulent time that introduced Europeans to the African stage. African nations fought for and eventually won their independence to become masters of their own destiny. Since then, the attitude of the average African towards Europe has largely evolved. With the exception of a few African communities, notably in the South, Africa is a very welcoming place to foreigners. While being a fair-skinned foreigner still draws attention, most of this is not hostile. It's common to see people of all races engage seamlessly with the local culture. So, yeah, identity politics are still prominent in Africa, and Hotel Rwanda showcases how tribalism can devolve, but race is hardly the main battleground for identity. This is a stark contrast to the West, or at least what Hollywood portrays of it, where racial scapegoating and animosity is an ever-growing effect of efforts to revive racial consciousness. This racial animus shines through Shuri's first exchange with Everett Ross in The Black Panther.
All right, where am I?
Don't scare me like that, colonizer.
My name is Everett.
Yes, I know.
The Dora Milaje have jurisdiction wherever the Dora Milaje find themselves to be.
Let's keep in mind that this is the first time that she speaks to him. Bilbo Baggins over here was too busy fighting Smaug to interrupt the mostly peaceful raids of the Agoji warriors. Seriously though, like Shuri, Everett Ross chose neither his skin color nor his ancestors. I remember a certain dude from the 60s say something about judging people by the content of their character. How quaint. Times are changing, and apparently it's trendy to judge people by the color of their skin these days. Slavery. Humanity has a dark legacy of slavery. We have been enslaving each other since the beginning of time. Romans enslaved their enemies, Europeans enslaved each other, and Africans enslaved Africans. Long before the Europeans, the Arabs crossed the Indian Ocean to open up African slave trade to the rest of the world.
Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
When the Europeans came, well, they wanted a piece of the action. They tapped into the slave trade and picked winners and losers among tribes that were already enslaving each other. The Dahomey are a great example of these so-called winners. Their ruthless Agoji warriors were infamous for their success in capturing African slaves for sale. The Woman King gets this much correct, but it conveniently inserts this popular fallacy that the Europeans started the slave trade, or at least it was unique to them.
For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked.
An even bigger crime to historical accuracy is glossing over the role of the British in ending the slave trade later on, sometimes in spite of strong resistance from African slavers. These misconceptions about the slave trade are a common trope in the West and may explain some of the racial animus today.
How do Senegalese really feel about slavery and what happened? Because, you know, there were a lot of very foul people involved in the slave trade. There was, of course, Europeans, you know, Jews and whites were involved, but, you know, Africans were involved in it as well. They were selling off their enemies, you know, the enemy tribes and making their money and so forth. Like, how was slavery really looked at out there?
Well, in Senegal, we've kind of overcome the thought of slavery. We don't even think about it. The only time we think about it, honestly, is when we're doing tours that go to island. You know, outside of that, people have lived and moved and way beyond the slavery concept and idea. I think it's also the art of just letting the past go and moving towards the future. And I think in the US, they have this stigma of just not letting go of the past and blaming the past on every mishap or, you know, disappointment. And I think as long as you hold on to that past, it's just a lot of weight that you carry with you everywhere you go. And it's hard to move forward and move fast.
Social values. Africa, like most of the world outside the West, is still socially traditional and conservative. Needless to say, this is a stark contrast to the views of most of Hollywood. For instance, this disconnect comes to the forefront on issues like gender and sexual identity. This perspective on queer sexuality extends to the highest levels of national politics.
What is your message to Western human rights groups, to President Obama, to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people?
Respect African societies and their values. If you don't agree, you just keep quiet. Let's manage our society the way we see. If we are wrong, we shall find out by ourselves. Just the way we don't interfere with yours.
Oh no, that's no democratic country, I hear you say. Well, This is what the president of Kenya had to say.
The issue of sexual preference in many African countries. In Kenya, to be gay, the LGBT community is illegal. They just want to have equal rights, the same equality as all other Kenyans do. Is that something that you aspire to for your country?
I want to be very clear. I will not engage in a subject that is of it is not of any major importance to the people and the Republic of Kenya. This is not an issue, as you would want to put it, of human rights or this. This is an issue of society, of our own base as a culture, as a people, regardless of which community you come from. This is not acceptable. This is not agreeable.
So, when fans of franchises like Disney's Marvel ask for more LGBT representation, well, that's a quick way to depart from what's realistic when it comes to prevalent African social values. That's all for this video. There are many ways that Hollywood misses the mark in depicting Africa. Which others did I leave out here? Let me know what you think down below. Stay tuned and stay cool.